see it full. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So thank you, Gael, for inviting me for this conference series. Thank you everybody for attending and for your interest in my topic. This topic is related, as Gael said, to my master thesis at the University of Munich, which was supervised by Friedhelm Hoffmann, and I got a lot of inspiring insights for this work also by Stefan Polis and Rainer Hannig. So in 1814, Jean-François Champollion, at the age of 24, he was very young, beginning his career in Egyptology. His first book was, in fact, on the Egyptian toponyms. I can hear some voices in the background. Gael, could you please mute everybody? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first book Jean-François Champollion wrote about ancient Egypt at the age of 24, before his decipherment in 1814, was entitled L'Égypte sous les pharaons. The goal of this book was, as he states in many times in the introduction, de faire connaître l'Égypte par lui-même. This means that he wanted to show the Egyptian perspective, the emic perspective on ancient Egypt. He wanted to do this by linking the Coptic and the Arabic versions of Egyptian place names, and so showing how the place names developed. I give you an example for this. In the section on Hermopolis Magna, he describes the Greek name of the city because in the Renaissance, in the European scientific discourse, it was foremost referred to by Hermopolis Magna, and the connection between the Greek toponyms and the Coptic and Arabic equivalents was largely lost in these times. Champollion, he realized that by comparing the names with the Arabic and Coptic scalae, so lists of place names, he could get towards a match of these names. And so he matched all the place names along the River Nile with their Coptic and Arabic equivalents. Here in the case of Hermopolis Magna, he links Hermopolis with Hermes and the ancient Egyptian Thoth. He then states that in the Coptic sources, he could find the name Shmoon, and furthermore, he also traces back in Arabic manuscripts Beledi etymologies for this place name. So, for example, he found in the manuscripts available at his time that it was explained by Arabic historiographers as Shmoon was explained as going back to a person called Shmoon, which was the son of Misr and the brother of Sa, Atrib, Kopt, and Tahmim, which are also cities in Egypt. So it's interesting that they linked the names of the cities to names of founding fathers in these times. But we will see that it's a bit different in reality. By doing this, by matching the Egyptian toponyms, he showed the different linguistic layers in which the Egyptian toponyms developed during times. And he could also show that the Greek toponyms are not in line with the organic linguistic development from ancient Egyptian through Coptic to Arabic. So the Greek toponyms are in fact traductions, but not literal traductions, but reformulations on basis of the divinities of these of the cities. In the following talk, I will focus on the first layer of Egyptian toponyms, so ancient Egyptian, and at the sources from the 2nd and the 3rd millennium before Christ. So I will not consider Demotic or Greco-Roman sources. When studying the geography of a modern country, we look at maps. So they tell a lot about the perspective of people, which they have towards their homeland, etc., and the worldview in general. So what about maps in ancient Egypt? There are not so many examples of maps. First of all, on the top right, you can see an 18th dynasty papyrus with sketches of fields, of domains. They are described as domains, the measurements. The papyrus calls out what is around these domains, so in the north, south, west, and east, etc. There might be some precursors in Middle Kingdom papyri you see at the bottom right, but their identification is very unsure due to their very fragile state of preservation. It was proposed by Collier and Quirk. The biggest, the largest manuscript we have from ancient Egypt, which depicts a landscape, is the Turin gold mine papyrus, which is currently prepared for publication by Stefan Polis and Andreas Dorn. In this papyrus, depicts the modern Wadi Hammamat, and it is not only a map and the first clear geographic map from ancient Egypt, but it is also at the same time a geological map with legends. So, for example, there's written that there's indicated in the middle here of the papyrus that the mountains which are painted in pink, they contain gold ores. There are also depicted stelae and different buildings. But why do I show you this? Because it's oriented southwards. So S to the right, you see, if the ancient Egyptian would have depicted a map of the whole country, which is highly unlikely because I think it would not have been so practical, they would have depicted it with the south on the top end. And this is also reflected in the lexicon of ancient Egyptian. So you have the word Yabed, which means east, but on the same time left. And Imenet, west, means at the same time right. The southern area is normally described as Henet, or you also have the word Henati, to go to south, while the north is the Bechu, the rear. There are also other terms for south and north, but these two they are not so common. They are not the most common terms, but they are also used to describe these two geographical areas. The same orientation is found in ancient Egyptian lists of place names. They begin from the south as the Nile, which begins from the south and proceeds to the north. So in the lists of Egyptian place names, for example, the so-called onomastica, I show you here two examples, the onomasticon at Berlin and one manuscript of the onomasticon of Amenemope, which is now at Moscow. These lists, they begin with Elephantine, then come to Komombo, to Edfu, etc., and go so until the delta from south to north. And in the delta, they list the cities in a circle, in a circular way. So there it deviates because the Nile, There's not only one Nile arm, but there are many ones. And that's also found the same arrangement in other lists of place names, for example, in hymns, where you have divinities which are listed according to the place they are venerated in, or in tribute lists, for example, in the tomb of Rechmira. Another important category when describing ancient Egyptian topographical reality is their perception of it as reflected in specific features of their graphical system. So when classifying ancient Egyptian toponyms, there are several possibilities. I want to point out the two most common ones. So you have the classifier of the desert, which is indicated by the three hills, and the classifier of the settlement, which is indicated by mm, uh, by this round with the two strokes crossing in the middle of it. So these two classifiers, in fact, they change during times, and also the classification of places changes. For example, when regarding border areas, they could use or the settlement classifier or the classifier describing more desert areas, but there are some principles of classification. So normally settlements in the Nile Valley are classified with the city classifier, and border regions outside the Nile Valley, regions in foreign territories are classified by the desert classifier. Border cases are, for example, Elephantine, which is classified with one, with two, or with both. And this can also reflect the Egyptian point of view. For example, Avaris, as you know, in the Second Intermediate Period, it is not part of the Theban realm, and therefore it is classified in Theban texts with a desert determinative, because it is foreign, of course. And it also depends on the specific context of the texts. So, for example, here in a tribute, in a scene where Ramses III at Medinet Habu offers different sacks of gold and other precious metals to the god Amun-Ra, these sacks, they contain the places where the gold comes from. And we have one sack, for example, mentioning gold coming from Edfu, and there Edfu, Jebba, is classified by the desert classifier. So it indicates that's not meant Edfu, the city, but the mines in the eastern desert of Edfu. And now we are step by step approaching the main topic of my talk, as when we have a deeper look at the spelling of another one of these sacks, you have gold from Koptos, Gibet in ancient Egyptian. And it is strange because you have in the spelling of Koptos, there is used a sign which kind of deviates from the standard sign you would expect in other texts, but it is very similar to the sacks which are depicted, in fact. So it might be an iconic response to this specific context, connecting the toponym Koptos with the sacks depicted. And this is in fact not so speculative, because you have also in texts from Coptos which describe the Coptic nome, and from the Greek Roman period, of course. So this is from the Roman period, the example I bring you. There, the Coptite region is described as bringing sacks of precious stones from his mines, as Coptos is well known as place where many expeditions depart from, for example, in the Wadi Hammamat, which we have seen before. This is an example of the this on the right side is an example of the late stylization of etymologies, which we will see in one moment. I will just shortly mention these rich sources of knowledge, of interpretations on ancient Egyptian toponyms, and then we'll go back to anterior periods and show what we have from them. So in the Greco-Roman period, and also in the second half of the first millennium before Christ, we have quite a lot of interesting texts, religious monographies on nomes, which are preserved in monumental form, but also in form of papyrus, which describe the religious, the topography, the myths, the religious background of Egyptian places, of Egyptian regions. If we take as an example Komombo, we have in the temple of Komombo explicit statements about how the name of this city emerged. So it is stated that this name came about because Osiris was fashioned, Nebi, Komombo is in Egyptian Nebut, because Osiris was fashioned there at Komombo as youngster by Geb and Shu. And another statement in the same line, you have a speak by Ra to Shu, who says that Shu has warded off the enemies from Ra, and thus Ra was called Hawa, which is the main deity, one of the main deities from Komombo. And then he states also, I fashioned my body, I repeated my Yauf, and thus one called her, the city, Nebit. So two statements linking the place name Nebit, Komombo, to the verb Nebi, to fashion. These interpretations are just found in sources of this period. We do not have such explicit statements in anterior periods. And if we look at the spelling of the place name here, it is interesting to compare it with contemporary sources, because the demotic contemporary sources, they deviate from the spelling in this traditional orthography from the temples. They show that the place name Nebit in fact evolved during times and became Imba in the end in local sources, which is the base for modern Komombo. The spelling which we find in the Temple of Komombo goes back, of course, to older spellings which use the traditional orthography. And here, when in the upper table, you can see the hieratic spellings of Komombo from the Middle Kingdom to the Third Intermediate period. I will show you some more of these tables in a minute, but here you can already see a tendency which I was able to spot through my work in many instances, which is that in hieratic sources, the development of toponyms is quite linear. So the different spellings, they seem to somehow replace each other in the course of times. So approaching now to the main period we are concerned with, so the third and the second millennium BC, and the provinces 1 to 9 of Upper Egypt, because these are coherent geographical area, and therefore it might be useful to study place names just in this area and not compare those with toponyms of the delta. This would be the topic of another talk. So for my general study, I collected about 3,000 attestations of place names in hieroglyphic and in hieratic sources, and I compared them and their evolution through times. To give you a short background on the typology of place names, which will be useful afterwards, I simplify a bit, but in general, you can divide ancient Egyptian toponyms into simple toponyms, for example, Abu, Ipu, Waset, etc., and composite toponyms. So the composite toponyms can, for example, be nominal phrases, the meadow of the falcon, the island of contestation, the house of the head. So normally you have a nomen regens, which consists of a geographic term with a description of a landscape, or with a specific human-made feature, a house, a temple, etc. And then an element specifying it. The second type, which is rarely attested of composite toponyms, are adverbial phrases. So, for example, my face is turned toward Amun. And the third type, which is quite common in royal domains, in royal foundations, are sentence names. For example, this Wach Sud, lasting are the places of Hakaurade justified at Abydos, which is a domain of Seyr the third at Abydos. For studying the diachronic development of toponyms, I evolved a specific method which is based on hieratic spellings. Therefore, here some hieratic spellings, because, as I told you before, they follow a linear development in many cases, but not in all cases, and these exceptions are due to the vast use of these toponyms in religious texts. So you can find some toponyms, for example, Abydos or Heliopolis, which do not follow this pattern because of their context. Because they are employed in contexts that are more likely to be written in old-fashioned way. Therefore, it might also be more useful, more telling to take just spellings from administrative documents. In contrast to these hieratic spellings, hieroglyphic ones are normally characterized by a cumulative development. So you have one spelling, then it develops like the hieratic spellings, but the hieroglyphic spellings, also the oldest ones, are in many cases preserved, and the whole period of their attestation. So just to give you one example for the hieratic spellings of one place name, you have the name of the Elephantine region, Abu, which follows, of course, this linear development. In the beginning, it has still the classifier or biconsonantal sign Abu, and then it develops towards a spelling with, first of all, the classifier of the stone vessel. Then the stone vessel gets distorted to the so-called pustule, and the first sign of the place name Ab develops into Yab due to phonetic reasons. I will not go further in this, but I show you that based on these regularities in the development on the Coptic versions of the placenet and on the syllable structure rules, the spellings seem to allow at least a partial reconstruction of the development of the place names. I did refrain from reconstructing the vowels because in toponyms which might be well, which might have local and non-local pronunciations. In my opinion, it is not wise to restore also the vocalization based on later sources, which are not necessarily from the same region. So let's take as a first case study the development of the names Uni, Armant, and Unet, Dendera. Both place names are characterized by the first sign Un, and then they have a different ending. So Uni, Armant, and Unet, Dendera with the feminine ending. As we have seen the organic development, it follows generally, in the case of Elephantine, it followed generally the normal graphic development of Egyptian script. So the initial Ab was replaced by Yab, which is in many words of the Egyptian lexicon, which is a development which we can trace in many words of the Egyptian lexicon, but it is not sure, just from this example, if this really reflects a phonologic reality, or if this reflects just a graphic reality. So if we want to elucidate this question, we have to take other examples. And therefore, I came to this example of uni and unet because if we develop them in a regular way, uni should lose the final j and unet should lose the final t at about, well, at least sometime before the New Kingdom. So we can see in the spellings of Uni that since the 18th dynasty, it is regularly written as Yunu, as Heliopolis, another place name, the famous religious center in the north of Egypt. In a second step, it is interesting that the name of Armant is written the same way as the name of Unet, Dendera. So the spelling is, they are similar, and I suppose that this is due to the homophony of both toponyms, and this is even strengthened. This might have been a very confusing situation for people back then. One could have asked, where do you come from? You come from Yuna. Ah, yes, which one? And therefore, it might have led towards a process of specifying the individual toponyms. So Uni, Armant, became Yunu and Menchu, so the Heliopolis of Mont, and Unet became, at least before the third intermediate period, Yunu ta Necheret, so Armant, the Yunu of Mont, the local deity, and Unet, Dendera, became the Yunu, the Heliopolis of the female goddess, which is the local divinity Hathor at Dendera. And it is even more interesting to look at these attestations in their concrete contexts. So if we take, for example, the tomb robbery dossier from Papyrus and British Museum 10,052, we have statements about different people and their provenience. In the first sentence, you can see that this person, Kamen, it is indicated that he comes from the city of Armant, which is written Yunu Menchu. And in the second example, you can see that the person is ascribed to the temple, to the Pera, the domain of Menchu, the lord of Yunu. So the specific place name which was employed has a pragmatic reason, as it is not clear if you just say in the city of Yunu, if this is Yunu or not if this is Yunu Armant or another Yunu, but you have to specify that it is the Yunu of Mont. But if in the contrary, you have Mont, the lord of Yunu, it is clear that Armant is meant. And so, at least in the 19th dynasty, we come to the distribution that in administrative contexts, Armant is called Yunu and Monshu. In epithets of the divinity Mont, it is called Yunu. And since the 20th dynasty, we have also in, I call them here religious, but it's in fact texts on temples, so monumentalized texts, local texts, it is called Yunushemai, so the southern Heliopolis. And the administrative name of Armant, it lives until today in the name of Armant, as does the administrative name of Dendera. A second case study departs from a composite toponym, which during times became lexicalized. The toponym at the origin is called Yad Negenu, which means the hill of the cattle. There are few attestations. I could prepare about 18 attestations in hieratic and hieroglyphic sources, and it is localized somewhere near today's Mualla Jebelain. If we take the spellings of this place name, here, due to the lack of attestations, I have to take the hieratic and the hieroglyphic ones. If we take them, we can see that the first attestations of the place name write Yat Negenu, so the hill of the cattle. Then an intermediate form is found in the second intermediate period, where it is agony with the classifier which indicates still the cattle, but the yard, the hill at the beginning of the spelling, is lost. And in the New Kingdom, finally, the whole group got lexicalized and became and was written in so-called syllabic writing. We will hear about this in some weeks in another conference of this series. So in fact, the toponym was not understood any longer, or was it reanalyzed? We cannot say for certainty. We can just say that the word negen for cattle is a very rare word, which afterwards became gen or ga. So it might have been that the negen in the place name was not understood any longer, and Yad was totally was taught in the second intermediate period, lost the final T, lost the Aleph, and so it lost a lot of its phonetic substance. And this is not just, it is not the only thing which could happen to composite toponyms. So you have this lexicalization, but we have also the reduction, which is, for example, attested in the case of Hut Sechem, another locality in the seventh nome of Upper Egypt. There, at the beginning, the place is called Hut Sechem Sheper Kara Macheru. It is a royal domain created in the Middle Kingdom and dependent on the Temple of Karnak. And in the course of times, it develops to Hut Sechem and then finally to Hut, which is the antecedent of the today's name of the city Hu. So we have seen different changes due to the phonological development of the Egyptian language. And now it should be legitimate to ask, because we have seen that the religious the religious topography, the religious, local religious beliefs, that they influence the reinterpretation of toponyms. So it is quite legitimate to ask if we cannot find also other traces, other phenomena related to this phenomena, not on the level of the composition of the toponyms, but on the level of single signs. And if we look at single signs, I should give you a background because it will become important in the next example of the classification of classifiers of toponyms. So we have seen at the beginning of the lecture that we have a certain set of classifiers, referential classifiers, which state, oh, that's a toponym. So you have in red here the city classifier, which says, oh, this is a city. And then there are in Egyptian composite toponyms, but not only, a certain set of classifiers which are called lexical classifiers, which identify the nature of the individual lexemes. So in this example, the place name Nashenu and Setech means the trees of Set, and the spellings show that the toponym was analyzed as the trees. You can see the tree in green of Set, and you can see the figure of the seated or squatting Set behind this. So these lexical classifiers tell us something about the emic analysis of these place names, but they might also be, and this is the case in many other words of the Egyptian lexicons, they might also be just relicts of ancient spellings. So we have to consider the two possibilities: or they tell us something significant, or they are just part of the graphemic structure and are not significant. In order to, I have found a very interesting example of the change of these classifiers in the place name of Hefat El Mualla. Here I give you the heretic attestations, which are only 10 in total. I could find 26 attestations of these place names. El Mualla lies also in the region of Jebel Ain. And you can see, if we highlight the classifiers in the same colors we did before, that in the New Kingdom, at a sudden, in hieratic sources, the snake appears as classifier of this toponym. Interesting is also that the feminine T seems to have dropped at this time, and so the place name became probably similar on a phonological level to the word hefau, snake. It might have been or similar before to the feminine version of snake, hefat, feminine snake, but this word is just attested from the New Kingdom onwards. So we have in the New Kingdom the place name with the snake classifier or written as a snake, and since the third intermediate period, even as per hefau, so house of the snake. Might this be a reinterpretation of the place name due to its phonological similarity to the name snake? Could be. Do we find other indications for this in the local theology? The local divinity, which is attested since the first intermediate period, is the god Hemen. It is vastly attested here, for example, in the tomb of Amphithya del Mualla. And you can see that it is depicted normally as a falcon. It has a falcon shape, this divinity. So this does not help us a lot. But What is this? We have a votive statue of Haman at the Louvre, where he kneels on top of a snake. And furthermore, the Haman seems to be connected to snakes also in other sources, for example, in the Book of the Dead spell 99a, where it is described where we have a now snake, which is in the hand of Haman. So might this be an indication that the toponym was reinterpreted on the base of this local specificity? We cannot prove it for sure, but I think that these two lines of thought might indicate it. So let's come to our last example, which is the place name Abydos. Abydos in the 8th nome of Upper Egypt. You see here a photo of this of the picture landscape. As I have indicated before, you can not see when taking the hieratic sources that the development is linear, but it is cumulative because Abydos was vastly used in religious and ritual texts from all periods, and therefore also more ancient spellings might have been preserved mm, and handed over from one manuscript to the other. You have the same evolution as in the case of Elephantine, with the first sign up replaced by the Yap sign. And it is interesting that in some attestations, the Ju sign, a phonogram, gets replaced by the Chased sign with three hills. And this might be, as you find it in hieratic and vastly in hieroglyphic sources, this might be a reinterpretation. This might also just be due to the similarity of both signs. But another sign is more interesting. The first sign, a phonogram, the phonogram up of this spelling. So this sign is quite interesting because it is not such a stable sign. I will explain this in a second. At the first place, in the Old Kingdom, the sign derives from a hand chisel. You can see on the right side one of those implements in use. So you have um, uh, you have a wooden part where you can put your hand on and the metal part on the bottom of the sign. And this form of the sign is also vastly attested, for example, here in the pyramid text of Pepi I. But in the first intermediate period, something seems to happen to this sign, and the the figurative mm, the figurativity of this sign seems to have been no longer fully understood by all the different scribal graphic traditions. So we have different forms of designs of design, for example, on the coffins at Achmim, at Asyut, at Stelae, at all kinds of monuments in this period. At the bottom left, you can see some examples which deviate from the standard traditional form and seem to reinterpret it and to assimilate it to other signs. Interesting enough, we also have hieratic forms of this sign in hieroglyphic inscriptions. So in the stela in the middle, for example, you see a hieratic form used on the bottom. You can see the hieratic form Forma Pinto of Hatnub. And this hieratic form was interestingly at a later time, in a later time in the first intermediate period, reanalyzed. So the upper part resembled a vessel in hieratic, and the lower part is just a stroke. And in fact, you can find hieroglyphic examples, hieroglyphic spellings reanalyzed as a vessel on top of a vessel stand in many instances in the 11th dynasty, for example. Here I just give you two examples from the Metropolitan Museum and from Turin, which have a Theban origin. And it gets even more interesting because this sign is also interpreted not only as an isolated sign, but also as a group. So at the left, you can see a spelling from a Middle Kingdom stele at Copenhagen, the National Museum, which sets the Ab sign above the Jebel, Ab above Jew. And this combination of signs, it gets more and more frequent until in the New Kingdom, where you can find it several times in the temple of Seti I at Abydos, for example, in the middle. And at the same time, the first sign is somehow reinterpreted as the Osirid fetish, the Osirid emblem, the local emblem at Abydos. So you have on the top, you have on the bottom one of these spellings where you can find on the top of the sign also a cobra and two feathers. And these two reinterpretations, they somehow got mixed finally here in a site, period stela, where you can find that the first sign of the place name has turned into a standard with the local Abydos fetish with the snake and with the two feathers standing on a pedestal which resembles these two mountains. And in fact, we have also this object attested as an archaeological artifact, which has been found at Abydos. You see it on the right side as it is at the Metropolitan Museum. So what have we seen? To sum up, we have seen a case where homophony leaded towards the rephrasing of toponyms. So Armant and Dendera, uni and unit. We have seen that toponyms could not only be extended to simple toponyms could not only be extended to complex toponyms, but complex toponyms could also be lexicalized or reduced, as in the case of the hill of the cattle, Yadnegen, or in the case of Hutzechen. On a more sign level, we have seen that secondary etymologies emerged through lexical classifiers, were expressed through lexical classifiers. And finally, in the case of Abydos, we have seen that also smaller constituents of the toponyms, just single signs, could be reinterpreted and could be charged with meaning. And having said this, I thank you for your attention. I hope that this lecture will stimulate also research on other Egyptian toponyms. As you have seen, I focused on only a small subset, and I am happy to answer to questions or to discuss with you. Thank you very much.